The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling prairie as the wagon train prepared for another day's journey westward. Samuel Sam Mitchell adjusted his weathered hat and checked the leather strap securing the canvas cover of the Henderson family wagon. The year was 1847, and like hundreds of other families, the Hendersons had sold everything they owned back in Missouri to chase the promise of free land in Oregon Territory. Sam wasn't traveling with family of his own. At 28 years old, he had signed on as a guide and protector for the wagon train, his reputation with both rifle and rope well known throughout Independence, Missouri. His weathered face told stories of countless cattle drives and frontier adventures, but his gentle eyes revealed a man who genuinely cared for the safety of those under his protection. The Henderson family consisted of Martha, a determined woman of 35 who had convinced her husband to make this dangerous journey, her husband Thomas, a blacksmith whose strong hands were more familiar with hammer and anvil than reins and oxen, and their 8-year-old daughter, Lucy. The little girl had become something of a mascot for the entire wagon train, her bright laughter and fearless curiosity bringing smiles to even the most hardened travelers. Lucy Henderson possessed the kind of spirit that couldn't be contained by the confines of a moving wagon. Her auburn hair, usually braided by her mother each morning, would inevitably work itself loose by midday as she climbed and explored everything within her reach. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and mischief, and she had developed an alarming habit of wandering off to examine interesting rocks, wildflowers, or anything else that caught her attention. This particular morning brought an unusual tension to the camp. The wagon master, a gruff man named Captain Jeremiah Holbrook, had received troubling news from his scout the previous evening. Heavy spring rains in the mountains had swollen the rivers ahead, making the usual crossing points treacherous or impassable. The normal ford at Willow Creek, which should have been shallow enough for the wagons to cross safely, was now a raging torrent of muddy water and debris. Sam studied the hand-drawn map that Captain Holbrook had spread across a wooden crate. The alternative routes would add weeks to their journey, precious time they couldn't afford to lose. Winter came early in the Oregon Territory, and arriving too late in the season could mean death for families caught in mountain snows without adequate shelter. "There's talk of trying the old crossing at Devil's Bend," Captain Holbrook said, his finger tracing a route along the map. "It's wider there, might be more manageable despite the high water." Sam shook his head slowly, having seen Devil's Bend during lower water levels the previous year. "That crossing has claimed wagons even in good conditions, Captain. The current runs stronger there because of the rocks channeling the flow. With this much extra water, you have a better suggestion, Mitchell?" The captain's tone carried the weight of a man responsible for 63 families and their hopes for a new life. Before Sam could answer, a commotion arose from the Henderson wagon. Martha Henderson was calling for Lucy, her voice carrying the edge of panic that every mother on the trail knew too well. The little girl had disappeared again, but this time her absence felt different, more ominous given the dangerous terrain they were approaching. Sam immediately joined the search, his trained eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the child. The area around their current camp offered too many hiding places: rocky outcroppings, stands of cottonwood trees, and several deep gullies carved by flash floods from previous seasons. Other families stopped their morning preparations to help look for Lucy, understanding that any child's safety was everyone's responsibility on the frontier. Thomas Henderson emerged from behind their wagon, his face pale with worry. "She was helping Martha pack the cooking pot just 20 minutes ago," he said, his blacksmith's hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "We turned around to fold the bedrolls and she was gone." The search continued for nearly an hour before Sam heard a faint voice calling from somewhere ahead of the wagon train. Following the sound, he discovered Lucy Henderson sitting on a fallen log near the edge of a steep embankment, completely unaware of the panic she had caused. She was carefully examining a collection of unusual stones, her small hands turning each one over to study its patterns and colors. "Lucy," Sam called out, relief evident in his voice. "Your parents are worried sick about you." The little girl looked up with innocent surprise. "I found these pretty rocks, Mr. Sam. Look how they sparkle when the sun hits them." She held up a piece of quartz that caught the morning light beautifully. Sam approached carefully, noticing how close she was sitting to the embankment's edge. One wrong move could send her tumbling down into the rocky ravine below. "Those are mighty pretty, Lucy, but you can't wander off like this. It's dangerous country we're heading into." "Mother says Oregon has even prettier rocks," Lucy said, carefully placing her treasures in her apron pocket. "She says there are rivers full of gold, just waiting to be found." As Sam helped Lucy down from the log and guided her back toward the wagons, he couldn't shake the feeling that her innocent comment about rivers had an ominous ring to it. The conversation with Captain Holbrook about river crossings was still fresh in his mind, and the sight of Lucy perched so carelessly near the edge of danger served as a stark reminder of how quickly tragedy could strike on the frontier. Martha Henderson embraced her daughter with tears of relief, scolding and kissing her in the same breath. Thomas Henderson's face showed the strain that every father on the trail carried, the constant fear that his decision to bring his family west might cost him everything he held dear. As the wagon train finally got underway that morning, Sam rode his horse alongside the Henderson wagon, keeping a watchful eye on Lucy, who sat beside her mother on the wagon seat. The little girl waved at him cheerfully, completely unbothered by the morning's drama, her pocket bulging with the rocks she had refused to leave behind. The landscape ahead began to change as they traveled west. The gentle rolling hills gave way to more rugged terrain, with rocky outcroppings and deeper valleys carved by centuries of water erosion. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached the river system that would either help them continue their journey or become their greatest obstacle. By mid-afternoon, they reached the high ground overlooking Willow Creek. What should have been a manageable stream was now a brown, churning torrent that stretched nearly twice its normal width. Uprooted trees swept downstream like battering rams, and the normally clear water had become an opaque mixture of mud, debris, and foam. Captain Holbrook called a halt to the wagon train and gathered the men for a council. The women and children remained with the wagons, but everyone could hear the heated discussion about whether to attempt the crossing or seek an alternative route. Sam studied the swollen creek with growing concern. Even if they could manage to get the wagons across, the danger to the families would be enormous. The water was moving too fast, and the bottom would be impossible to judge with all the mud and debris. One wagon stuck or overturned in that current would be lost forever, along with anyone unfortunate enough to be trapped inside. Lucy Henderson climbed down from her family's wagon and approached the edge of the overlook, her curiosity once again overriding caution. "Look how fast the water moves, Mother," she called back to Martha. "It's like it's racing to get somewhere important." Martha Henderson hurried to her daughter's side, grasping the child's hand firmly. The sight of the raging water below filled her with dread, but Lucy seemed fascinated by the power and speed of the flood-swollen creek. As evening approached, Captain Holbrook announced his decision. They would make camp here for the night and attempt to cross at Devil's Bend in the morning, despite the risks. The alternative routes would take too long, and winter weather was already threatening in the higher elevations they needed to reach. That night, as families gathered around their campfires, the mood was somber. Everyone understood the danger they would face at dawn, but turning back was not an option for people who had already risked everything on this journey. Children were held closer, prayers were said more fervently, and more than one person lay awake listening to the distant roar of the angry water that stood between them and their dreams of a new life in Oregon territory. Dawn broke gray and threatening over the wagon train camp, with heavy clouds promising more rain before the day ended. Sam Mitchell had barely slept, spending most of the night walking the perimeter of the camp and listening to the relentless roar of the swollen creek below. The sound had grown even louder during the night, suggesting that more water was flowing down from the mountain watersheds. Captain Holbrook gathered the men before sunrise to finalize their crossing strategy. Devil's Bend lay 2 miles downstream from their current position, where the creek widened and the banks were lower, theoretically making it easier for wagons to enter and exit the water. However, Sam had scouted the area the previous evening and discovered that what appeared to be an advantage might actually be a deadly trap. The wider channel means the current spreads out some, but it also means we'll be in the water longer, Sam explained to the assembled men. That creek bottom is full of holes and loose rocks. One wagon gets stuck or tips over and the families behind it will be trapped in the middle of the crossing. Thomas Henderson stood with the other men, his face etched with worry. As a blacksmith, he understood the mechanics of moving heavy objects, and the thought of getting his wagon loaded with all their worldly possessions across that raging water filled him with dread. More importantly, the thought of putting Martha and Lucy at risk made his stomach turn. "What if we lighten the wagons?" suggested another traveler. "Leave behind everything that isn't absolutely essential?" Captain Holbrook nodded grimly. "That's exactly what we'll do. Furniture, extra tools, anything that can be replaced. It all stays here. We take only food, clothing, medicine, and basic necessities." The next hour was heartbreaking to watch as families sorted through their belongings, deciding what pieces of their former lives they could afford to abandon. Martha Henderson fought back tears as she placed her grandmother's china set beside the trail, knowing they would never see it again. Thomas reluctantly added his collection of specialized blacksmithing tools to the growing pile of discarded items. Lucy wandered among the abandoned belongings with childlike fascination, not fully understanding why families were leaving behind so many interesting things. She stopped beside a wooden rocking chair that belonged to the Wilkins family and began to rock gently back and forth. "We can't take it with us, sweetheart," Mrs. Wilkins explained, kneeling beside the little girl. "It's too heavy for the wagons to carry across the water." "But who will rock the babies to sleep?" Lucy asked with innocent concern. Mrs. Wilkins's eyes filled with tears as she hugged the child. "We'll find other ways, dear one. We'll find other ways." By mid-morning, the lightened wagon train began its descent toward Devil's Bend. Sam rode ahead to mark the safest path down to the water's edge, using his rope to test the stability of the rocky slope. Behind him, the wagons moved slowly, their owners walking beside the oxen to guide them carefully down the treacherous incline. The sight that greeted them at the crossing point was even more intimidating than Sam had feared. The creek had risen another foot during the night, and the current moved with such force that it created standing waves where the water hit submerged rocks. Debris continued to sweep downstream. Tree branches, pieces of lumber that might have come from an upstream settlement, and once, horrifyingly, the bloated carcass of a cow that had been caught in the flood. Captain Holbrook decided that Sam would lead the first wagon across to test the route and establish a safety line. If successful, the other wagons would follow one at a time, with experienced horsemen positioned upstream and downstream to assist if needed. The first crossing went better than expected. Sam's horse was strong and sure-footed, and by carefully picking his way along the upstream edge of the channel, he managed to find a route where the water never rose above his saddle. He secured a rope to a sturdy cottonwood tree on the far side and signaled for the first wagon to attempt the crossing. 3 wagons made it safely across using Sam's rope as a guide. The families cheered from both sides of the creek, and hope began to replace fear in many hearts. Perhaps they would all make it across without incident after all. The Henderson wagon was fourth in line. As Thomas guided their oxen into the muddy water, Martha held Lucy close beside her on the wagon seat. The little girl seemed more excited than frightened by the adventure. pointing out interesting things she noticed in the swirling water around them. Everything went wrong in the space of a heartbeat. Halfway across the creek, one of the oxen stepped into an unseen hole and stumbled, throwing off the rhythm of the team. The wagon lurched sideways just as a large piece of debris struck the upstream wheel. The impact was enough to break the axle, and the wagon began to tip toward the deeper water. Thomas Henderson's shout of alarm was lost in the roar of the creek as the wagon continued to tip. Martha tried desperately to hand Lucy to her husband, but the angle of the wagon seat made it impossible to reach him. The wagon was going over, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Sam saw the disaster unfolding from his position on the far bank. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse back into the raging water, but he was too far downstream to reach the Henderson family before the wagon completed its deadly roll. The wooden vehicle crashed onto its side with a sickening crunch, immediately beginning to break apart as the current caught it. Martha Henderson disappeared beneath the canvas wagon cover as it filled with water. Thomas had been thrown clear and was fighting to stay afloat while trying to reach his family. But it was 8-year-old Lucy who faced the greatest danger. The little girl had been thrown from the wagon seat and was now being swept downstream by the powerful current, her small head bobbing in and out of the muddy water as she struggled to breathe. From both banks of the creek, people were shouting and pointing, but no one was close enough to help. The other wagons couldn't move quickly enough to intercept Lucy's path, and the horsemen positioned as safety guards were dealing with Thomas and Martha Henderson. Sam made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of the outcome. He could see that other men were moving to help Thomas and Martha, who were both strong swimmers and had a chance of survival. But Lucy was just a child, already exhausted from fighting the current, and she was being carried toward a section of the creek where jagged rocks created a deadly maze of obstacles. Abandoning his position helping with the wagon, Sam drove his horse directly across the current's line, angling to intercept Lucy's path. The water was deeper here, well over his horse's head, and the current was strong enough to sweep away a full-grown man, let alone a little girl. The horse fought valiantly against the rushing water, its powerful legs churning as it struggled to maintain direction against the creek's relentless push. Sam could see Lucy ahead of him, her small arms flailing weakly as she tried to stay above the surface. She was tiring quickly, and if he didn't reach her soon, the current would carry her into the rock field where no one could survive. Behind him, Sam could hear voices calling his name, some shouting encouragement, others yelling warnings about the rocks ahead. He blocked out everything except the sight of Lucy's auburn hair, reflecting the gray morning light as she fought for her life in the merciless water. His horse was beginning to founder, the powerful animal's strength nearly exhausted by the battle against the current. Sam realized they weren't going to make it unless he did something drastic. Without allowing himself to think about the consequences, he slipped from his saddle into the icy water and began swimming toward Lucy with desperate, powerful strokes. The cold water was a shock that drove the air from his lungs, but Sam forced himself to keep moving. His heavy boots and clothes dragged at him, threatening to pull him under, but the sight of Lucy's terrified face kept him going. She had stopped fighting the current and was simply trying to keep her head above water, her strength nearly gone. Sam reached her just as she went under for what might have been the last time. His hand closed around her small wrist, and he pulled her to the surface, gasping and choking but alive. Now came the even harder task of getting both of them out of the deadly water before the rocks claimed them both. Looking around frantically, Sam spotted a fallen tree whose branches extended into the water about 30 yards downstream. If he could angle their drift in that direction, they might have a chance of grabbing onto something solid. But the current was carrying them directly toward the center of the rock field, where the water funneled between two massive boulders with enough force to crush anything caught between them. With Lucy clinging weakly to his neck, Sam began swimming at an angle across the current, using every ounce of his remaining strength to fight toward the fallen tree. Behind them, he could hear his horse whinnying in distress, the animal still struggling in the deep water, but unable to help anymore. The rocks were getting closer, their dark surfaces slick with spray from the churning water. Sam could feel Lucy's grip loosening as exhaustion and cold began to overcome her small body. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the current would carry them into the deadly maze where no human strength could save them. Just when it seemed they wouldn't make it, Sam's outstretched hand touched something solid. A branch from the fallen tree, thick enough to support their weight, extended just far enough into the current to reach them. With his last reserves of strength, Sam grabbed the branch and held on desperately as the current tried to tear them away from their lifeline. Lucy was barely conscious now, her face pale and her lips blue from the cold water. Sam knew he had to get her out of the creek immediately or risk losing her to exposure and shock. Using the tree branch to support them, he began working his way toward the bank, inch by painful inch, while the current continued its relentless attempt to claim them both. The struggle to reach the bank seemed to last forever, though it probably took no more than 5 minutes. Sam's arms ached from fighting the current while supporting Lucy's weight, and his waterlogged boots felt like anchors dragging at his legs. But the fallen cottonwood tree held firm against the creek's assault, providing the solid anchor they desperately needed to work their way to safety. Other members of the wagon train had reached the bank and were extending ropes and branches to help with the rescue. Captain Holbrook himself waded into the shallower water near shore, his weathered hands reaching out to grab Lucy as soon as Sam could get her close enough. The moment the captain's strong arms closed around the little girl, Sam felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly caused him to lose his grip on the tree branch. "I've got her, Sam!" Captain Holbrook shouted over the roar of the water. "Get yourself out of there before that tree gives way!" Sam looked back toward the main channel where they had started their desperate journey. His faithful horse had somehow managed to fight its way to the far bank, where other travelers were helping to pull the exhausted animal to safety. The horse stood on shaking legs, sides heaving from the ordeal, but alive and unhurt. It was a small miracle in the midst of so much chaos and danger. Getting Sam himself out of the water proved more difficult than anyone expected. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and his waterlogged clothing had sapped his strength to the point where he could barely lift himself from the creek. It took 3 men working together to haul him up the muddy bank, where he collapsed face down on the rocky ground, coughing up creek water and gasping for air. Lucy Henderson lay motionless on a blanket that Martha Henderson had spread beside the water. The little girl's face was pale, her lips still blue from the cold, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Martha knelt beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face as she chafed the child's cold hands and spoke to her in soothing tones. "Come back to us, sweetheart," Martha whispered. "You're safe now. Mr. Sam got you out of the water. You're safe." Dr. William Hayes, a physician traveling with the wagon train to establish a practice in Oregon Territory, pushed through the crowd of concerned onlookers and knelt beside Lucy. His experienced hands checked her pulse and breathing while his eyes assessed her condition with professional concern. "She's taken in some water, but her breathing is steady," Dr. Hayes announced to the anxious crowd. "We need to get her warm and dry immediately. The cold is as dangerous as the water at this point." Several women hurried to gather dry blankets and clothing while the men built up a large fire near the rescue site. Thomas Henderson, who had been pulled from the creek downstream by 2 other travelers, limped over to where his daughter lay. His own clothes were soaked and muddy, and a gash on his forehead showed where debris had struck him during his struggle in the water, but his only concern was for Lucy. "Will she be all right, doctor?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Dr. Hayes wrapped Lucy in warm, dry blankets and positioned her near the fire. "Children are remarkably resilient, Thomas. She's young and strong, and Mr. Mitchell got her out before the water could do permanent damage. With warmth and rest, she should recover completely." As if to prove the doctor's words, Lucy's eyes fluttered open about 10 minutes later. She looked around in confusion, clearly disoriented by finding herself wrapped in blankets beside a fire instead of fighting for her life in the creek. "Mother," she whispered in a voice made hoarse by creek water and exhaustion. Martha Henderson sobbed with relief as she gathered her daughter into her arms. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. You're safe now." Lucy's eyes found Sam, who was sitting nearby wrapped in his own collection of blankets while recovering from his ordeal. Despite her weakness, she managed a small smile that seemed to light up her pale face. "Did you save me, Mr. Sam?" she asked in that direct way that children have of getting to the heart of matters. Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked at the brave little girl who had nearly been lost to the merciless water. "We saved each other, Lucy. You helped me be braver than I thought I could be." The rescue had taken nearly 2 hours from start to finish, and the day was advancing toward afternoon. Captain Holbrook faced the difficult decision of whether to continue attempting crossings or make camp and wait for better conditions. The Henderson wagon was a total loss, its contents scattered downstream or buried in the muddy creek bottom. 2 families would have to share space in other wagons for the remainder of the journey. But the most immediate concern was the effect the accident would have on the morale and courage of the other families. 3 wagons had crossed successfully before the Henderson disaster, but now 5 more waited on the dangerous side of the creek. The people in those wagons had watched the terrifying rescue unfold and were understandably reluctant to risk their own families in the treacherous water. Sam, despite his exhaustion, volunteered to help scout an alternative crossing point further downstream. His actions during Lucy's rescue had elevated his status among the travelers from respected guide to genuine hero, and people listened when he spoke. If Sam Mitchell said a crossing was safe, families were willing to trust their lives to his judgment. The alternative crossing they found was narrower but deeper, with a rock ledge that extended partway across the creek bed. By using ropes and having the strongest swimmers guide each wagon team, they managed to get all the remaining families across before sunset. It was dangerous work, but the systematic approach and extra precautions meant no other wagons were lost. Lucy Henderson rode in the Wilkins family wagon for the rest of the journey, her own family's transportation destroyed in the creek. She had recovered remarkably well from her ordeal, showing the resilience that Dr. Hayes had predicted, but the experience had changed her in subtle ways. The fearless curiosity that had led to so many adventures was tempered now with a healthy respect for danger. The rocks she had collected that morning before the crossing were lost with everything else in the wagon, but she seemed less concerned about material possessions now. Instead, she spent her time helping Mrs. Wilkins with cooking and camp duties, showing a newfound maturity that surprised the adults around her. 3 weeks after the creek crossing, the wagon train reached a high plateau where they could see the Columbia River Valley spreading out below them. Oregon Territory stretched to the horizon, green and welcoming under an autumn sky that promised good weather for the final weeks of their journey. That evening, as families gathered around their campfires to celebrate reaching this milestone, Lucy Henderson approached Sam with something hidden behind her back. The little girl had been secretive for several days, working on some kind of project with scraps of fabric and leather that she had begged from various families. "I made something for you, Mr. Sam," she said shyly, producing a small leather pouch decorated with colorful stitching. "Mrs. Wilkins helped me with the sewing, but I did all the decorating myself." Sam accepted the gift with surprise and genuine pleasure. The stitching was uneven and clearly the work of a child, but the love and gratitude that had gone into its creation made it more valuable than any store-bought item. "It's for your important things," Lucy explained seriously. "Mother says every cowboy needs a special place to keep his important things." Sam carefully placed the pouch in his saddlebag, next to his most prized possessions. "This will be perfect, Lucy. Thank you." The final weeks of the journey passed without major incident. Families began to separate as they reached their intended destinations, some heading for the Willamette Valley to establish farms, others continuing north toward Puget Sound or California. The Henderson family planned to settle near Salem, where Thomas hoped to establish a blacksmith shop to serve the growing community of settlers. On the last night before the wagon train would disperse completely, Captain Holbrook called everyone together for a final celebration. Families shared food and stories, children played games in the firelight, and several travelers produced musical instruments for an impromptu concert under the stars. During the evening, Captain Holbrook stood to address the group. "We've traveled over 2,000 miles together," he began, his gruff voice carrying unusual emotion. "We've faced dangers and hardships that tested every one of us. Some of us lost possessions, some lost livestock, and some of us came very close to losing much more than that." His eyes found Sam and Lucy across the fire. "But we also saw the best that human beings can offer each other. We saw courage that goes beyond what any reasonable person should be asked to give. We saw a man risk his own life for a child who wasn't his own, simply because it was the right thing to do." The entire group turned to look at Sam, who felt uncomfortable with the attention but understood its importance. These people needed to believe that such courage existed in the world, especially as they faced the challenges of building new lives in unfamiliar territory. "Mr. Mitchell reminded us that we're not just individual families making this journey," Captain Holbrook continued. "We're a community. And in a community, every life matters, every child matters, every person matters." The following morning brought tearful farewells as families loaded their wagons for the final time and headed toward their individual destinations. The Hendersons were among the last to leave, Thomas wanting to thank Sam personally for what he had done at the creek crossing. "I can never repay what you did for us," Thomas said, gripping Sam's hand firmly. "You gave me back my daughter and my family's future." Martha Henderson hugged Sam with tears in her eyes. "You'll always have a home with us in Salem, Sam Mitchell. Always." Lucy's goodbye was the hardest of all. The little girl had attached herself to Sam during the weeks after the rescue, following him around camp and peppering him with questions about cowboy life and frontier adventures. Now she faced the reality that their paths were diverging, perhaps forever. "Will I see you again, Mr. Sam?" she asked, trying to be brave but unable to keep the tears from her eyes. Sam knelt down to her level and spoke seriously, understanding that children deserved honest answers to important questions. "I don't know, Lucy. The frontier is a big place, and people's paths don't always cross again. But I'll never forget you, and I'll always wonder how you're doing." "I'll never forget you either," Lucy promised solemnly. "And when I grow up, I'm going to tell everyone about the cowboy who saved me from the menacing waters." As the Henderson wagon rolled away toward their new life, Sam watched until it disappeared over a distant ridge. He thought about the chain of events that had brought him to that moment beside the swollen creek, when a split-second decision to help a drowning child had revealed something about himself that he hadn't known existed. Years later, when Sam had established his own ranch in eastern Oregon and started a family of his own, he would tell his children the story of Lucy Henderson and the lesson he learned about the value of a single life. He would teach them that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when someone else's life hangs in the balance. The leather pouch that Lucy had made for him remained among his most treasured possessions until the day he died. A reminder of the morning when menacing waters had swept away a wagon and revealed the depths of courage that ordinary people could find within themselves when extraordinary circumstances demanded it.